Welcome. My name is Katie Seal. I am the Senior Archivist with the State Historical Society of Missouri at the Rolla Research Center. Today's presentation is going to take a closer look at the young men affected by executive order that came here to Rolla under the Student Release Program. Dr. Larry Gragg, Distinguished Teaching Professor Emeritus of History, and Debbie Griffith, the indispensable University Archivist at Missouri S&T, are both here to present on the experiences of these students at the then Missouri School of Mines. Larry and Debbie, welcome to both of you, and I will turn things over to you.
Thank you, Katie. I appreciate everyone tuning into this topic, which is genuinely one of the most important ones in the 20th century. Our focus today with this complex topic is what was it like for some of these Japanese American young men to come to the University of Missouri School of Mines and Metallurgy in Rolla, Missouri during World War II. And what we're going to do as co-presenters for this presentation, I'm going to give you some national context for what happened, why there was an internment, what the rationale was, and then what was the process for applying to a college or a university. And then Debbie is going to share her extraordinary research into what she found out about these young men that came to Rolla, what their experience was like at Rolla, and then I will come back and talk about what the federal government did in the post-World War II era to, quote, right the wrong that had been done to over 120,000 Japanese Americans. So to give you some context, some background to all of this, almost everyone knows about the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, and most people are aware of the extraordinary anger that Americans felt towards the Japanese government for this attack because the United States lost just over 2,400 in that attack, and about 1,100 were wounded but survived. And most Americans have an appreciation for the extraordinary fear that developed on the West Coast because there was this sense that maybe this was only the first assault on America, that there may be a future assault on the continental West Coast. Indeed, during the war, from mid-December of 41 to October of 42, there were several Japanese submarines between the Hawaiian Islands and the West Coast. And really late in the war, Japan released about 6,000 balloon bombs over the West Coast of the United States and the Canadian provinces. So there was some sense of a reality to a threat potentially to the West Coast of the United States. But what President Franklin Roosevelt was interested in immediately was there any assistance given to Japan to the attack on December 7, 1941? So he appointed a commission chaired by the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Owen Roberts, and they quickly issued a report in which they told the president that they found no evidence of Japanese Americans on the Hawaiian Islands who assisted in the attack, although it was clear to the people on the commission that some of the Japanese delegation may have assisted. Now, the bigger threat was this fear of Japanese Americans on the West Coast as potential enemies. And there were 3 more investigations. And these are all done contemporaneously. They're all done between mid-December and early February of 1942. One of the concerns was that there were Japanese Americans on the West Coast that were signaling shore to ship to assist the Japanese. There were concerns that Japanese Americans may be stockpiling weapons and ammunition to use if the nation of Japan should invade the West Coast. So the Federal Communications Commission investigated, and their conclusion was that there was no substance to the charge, that there was signaling going on between the shore and to Japanese ships. And in the FBI investigation, they concluded that indeed, some Japanese Americans did own weapons, some Japanese Americans did have ammunition, but they concluded there were no dangerous persons involved. In fact, the director of the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover, told President Roosevelt that Japanese Americans posed no real threat to American security. Now, the fourth report, which gets the name the Ringel Report, which is late December of 1941, named after the naval commander who completed the investigation, Ringel concluded that there may be perhaps 300 individuals that needed to be observed, but in the report, they recommended that no decision be made about the collective 120,000 plus Japanese Americans. So if all those reports are accurate and there was no meaningful threat to national security, why was there an internment? So there are about three reasons that historians have disclosed. One has to do with the general who was the head of the Western Defense Command, General DeWitt. DeWitt made a recommendation in a letter to President Roosevelt and later released a full report that backed up his recommendation. And there are two things that are critical to the DeWitt recommendation: that there be the removal of Japanese Americans from the West Coast. He argued that Japanese Americans collectively represented a group that could not be assimilated into the general American culture. And secondly, he argued in his recommendation that Japanese Americans too often live near critical installations, military bases, harbors, oil fields, lighthouses, and he conceived them to be a military threat. So his recommendation was for removal. Now, Roosevelt also considered the feelings of the non-Japanese Americans living on the West Coast, and particularly the governor of California, Cuthbert Olson, who said, as far as he could determine from all the feedback he was getting from the residents of his state, that virtually none of them trust the Japanese. Now, there's one more factor that has to be included here, and that involves President Roosevelt himself. He had been the Assistant Secretary of the Navy before World War I. He became very familiar with the nation of Japan, very respectful of what they had accomplished. But as he looked at the immigration from Japan to the United States, he concluded, much like DeWitt would later conclude, that Japanese Americans would not fully assimilate into American culture. Now, that's not a unique perspective. Many, if not most, established Americans had the same view towards the Japanese. It is this general antipathy that this is a group of immigrants who had no interest in assimilating, which was untrue. The second generation, the Nisei, were very much assimilated into American culture. This antipathy, however, was part of a piece of legislation in 1924, which led to essentially a ban on all Japanese immigration into the United States. So this decision that Roosevelt will make to order the removal of Japanese Americans from the West Coast, and 2/3 of them, roughly 2/3, are American citizens, is really not based upon military necessity. So how did this process work? There was about a week heads up given to these folks so they could plan to dispose of whatever property they could in that very short time period. None of them was indicted. There was no individual review of their situation or their case. They were simply told they had a limited period of time to pack 2 bags each. They had the clothes that they were wearing on their back. And they were first sent to assembly centers, which tended to be state fairgrounds, where there's lots of space, or in Southern California to racetracks. And then they were sent on to 10 relocation centers, which were located in 6 states. 5 of those states were interior states, even as far away as Arkansas. And most of them ended up throughout the war living in wooden barracks, and they were surrounded by barbed wire. There were armed guards. They tried to, as best they could, recreate the culture of their neighborhoods in these camps. They would stay there in most cases until December of 1944, when President Roosevelt lifted the order. Now, there were a couple of ways that one could legally leave the camps. One was, and it's really an ironic way to leave, that is to enlist in the Army to serve the nation that had put you and your family into an internment camp. But many young men did it. As far as I could determine, a little over 30,000 enlisted. The biggest unit was the 442nd Regiment. This regiment was very much involved in the invasion of Italy in the summer of 1944. And as a unit, it was one of the most highly decorated units, many commendations, many medals. And after the Italian campaign, they moved north further into Europe. That was one way. But the way we're really concerned with today is getting admitted to a college or a university. Now, several historians have looked at this subject, and they've determined that roughly 4,000, maybe a few more than 4,000, who had been interned did get admitted to a college or university. Many of them had already been in college, and they were transfer students. Now, the protocol for this was first to apply to this council with this really long name, the National Japanese-American Student Relocation Council, and it's formed, as you can see, very shortly after the Roosevelt order on February 19th for the removal of these 120,000 plus Japanese Americans. Looking through some of the applications of students who came to the Missouri School of Mines and Metallurgy, I was able to get a sense of the kinds of materials that they had to supply. A letter of application, letters of reference to support their application, transcripts of courses they had already taken in college. And once the council had approved them, they also had to face an FBI background check to determine their loyalty to the United States. And one additional piece, if any of these prospective students had been to Japan, they also had to get approval from the War Department. So you had to jump through 3 hoops in some cases. Now, the number of colleges that accepted these students by the end of the war was about 450. So if there are 4,000 plus students at 450 colleges and universities, there aren't many colleges that will take many of these students. Now, the intriguing piece for a school like the Missouri School of Mines and Metallurgy is that 15% of all these students were interested in studying engineering, which made the Missouri School of Mines and Metallurgy an attractive possibility. Now, in going through all the materials that I saw in the boxes of application material, one letter really stuck out to me, and it comes from the assistant registrar at the Missouri School of Mines, a man named Noel Hubbard, who's writing to his counterpart, the registrar on the Columbia campus, Woodson, Canada. And I've lifted a couple of quotes from that letter, which are quite instructive and suggest that what these young men were going to face was a dismal prospect when they came to Rolla. Note what I've put in as a quote: none of us, and we're assuming here that Noel Hubbard is talking about the campus, or maybe even the community of Rolla, none of us are burning with enthusiasm over the prospect of having these Japanese American students. And he went on in the letter to write, "We don't think that we should take very many boys of this status here." So with that prospect, it's going to be intriguing for you to listen to Debbie talk about what she learned about what happened to these young men once they got to the School of Mines and Metallurgy. So Debbie, it's all yours.
Thank you very much, Larry. Let me unmask. Okay, well, eventually we did wind up taking 13 plus Nisei students here at the Missouri School of Mines. And apologies to families if I mispronounce these names, but the names are Shigeru Mike Fujimoto, Masashi Hayashi, Kei Kanayuki Ikeyue, Makoto Joseph Kawaguchi, Tadayuki Kawaguchi. Now, he has an asterisk because he did not come through the official program when the internment process started. He was actually in the Army, not in the 442nd, but he was in a unit where he was the only Japanese American over in France. He did perform some very heroic acts that we found out later about, but when he was out of the Army, he came here to be with his brother Makoto. Katsumi Dan Kozeni, Satoshi Rei Kuwamoto, Yasuyuki Kuwamoto, yes, those are brothers, James Toru Nishioka, Jack Nome, Kunio Jakazawa, Miles Noboru Suda, Koru Uetake, and Donald Yamamoto. Of these people, the only one to stay after graduation is Kore Uchiha, who stayed here to work on his master's degree, which he did receive. Not all of these 14 students graduated from the Missouri School of Mines. Some left when the camps closed to go back to school closer to their original homes. So there are a variety of reasons they may have left without graduating. When we were looking to find out who exactly had come to our campus, we originally had a list of 6 names, but we have some resources here on campus that were helpful in finding the rest of these students. The list here is the Rolla, which is our campus yearbook, student cards, the Missouri Miner, which is our student newspaper, and our alumni magazine, which has had a variety of names over the years. The Rolla, the Miner, and the alumni magazines have all been digitized and are available on our university website. So they are freely available for people to use. And this is what that website looks like. If you go to scholarsmine.mst.edu, you can get to this. And it is keyword searchable. So if I want to find all the mentions of Jack Nome, which I have entered here, just search on it, and it is going to give me a list of all of the different publications, 70 results. In some cases, the digitization split in the middle of the word economics. So you do have to kind of go through there a little bit to find what you're actually looking for. Going through the yearbooks, I first looked for Japanese names, faces that may have looked to me Asian, and got a list of names. Then I went to these student cards. Oops. And we have this entire set of student cards for most of our students. They go back to 1871 up until 1973 when FERPA, the Student Privacy Act, was implemented. So we have these student cards for all of those folks. I'm going to zoom in so you can see exactly what one of these cards looks like. This is the card for Kane Uchiha, and you can see here the front side of the card has information such as his name, when he was born, where he was born. This section of the card, and I hope you can see the little hand moving, is where the individual professors could rank students on a variety of characteristics such as leadership, reliability, energy, personality. Over here, we've got their scholastic record, which shows us that K arrived in 42 to 43. The way that these cards helped us determine if a student was part of the internee program or just a Japanese American student who'd already been enrolled here was looking at the home address field down at the bottom. And in this case, it says a long number and then Poston, Arizona. Poston, Arizona is one of the camps that were used during World War II. And the numbers at the beginning are the barracks number that he was in. In the yearbook itself, they also would list the hometown for the students. And again, going back into the yearbooks and looking for Poston, Topaz, Menadaka, all those different names to try and find more students. That way we got up to about 10 students. The second side of the card, the back side, shows the activities, student honors, and graduation information for a student. And in this case, for Kane Uchiha, he was essentially the first student to come to the university here. He sort of served as a leader for the students who came after him. He threw himself into student life here. He was involved in student government, professional associations. He was working as a student assistant in the chemistry and the technical drawing departments. He was working in the library as a student assistant. He also had a job at one of the movie theaters in town. Part of the process of getting to come to a school in the Midwest was you had to pay your own way. In many cases, churches or Buddhist temples might have provided some funding. The schools may have provided small scholarships, but once the students got here to pay for room and board and anything else, they needed to get a job. And Kay was very active in seeking employment. He also was a member of the St. Pat's Board, probably the first non-Caucasian student to be part of the board. He joined the tech club, that's one of our eating clubs, but then eventually switched to the engineering eating club. And we see that across all of the students. So they were following his path, joined tech, switched to engineers. He was a member of the Independents. And if you are an alumni of the school, you'll probably know that as the GDIs. That is indeed the same group. He served as their president, vice president. He was their representative to the intramural sports. He was also part of the photography club, their vice president later on. He had been at Porter-Nick Junior College before he was put into one of the camps. So we have that kind of information about them, where they transferred from, what kind of activities they were into. We can see over on the right-hand side that he was on the honor list. He was a member of AIME. He won the Steinmesh Technical Writing Prize in 1946. Down below, we've got his graduation date in 1946. So we see, he stayed here after the camps had been opened or released, people released from the camps. So he stayed here to finish his degree. He got his bachelor's in metallurgical engineering. The penciled in information below that is where he attended graduate school. So he went to the University of Chicago from here and enrolled in their Metals Institute. Once we had a list of names, and by this point I think I had 10 names, then we started looking at different websites, and all of this information is included in the subject guide on our university website. There were several sites that had really good information for us, and those are Densho, Sorted by Name, the National Archives, the Library of Congress, the Hoover Institute out in California, and a magazine called Pacific Citizen. Densho is a really wonderful site. It's a community-generated website. They are looking at their mission, as they state, is to preserve and share history of the World War II incarceration of Japanese Americans to promote equity and justice today. It is a wonderfully rich resource. They have many different oral histories. They have a very large digital archives with photographs. They have information on how individual families can create their own archives within this. They are always adding material. This is very much a live site. Part of what they've got here is called the encyclopedia, and that is very helpful. It defines a lot of concepts. It goes into a lot more detail than many of the other sites that I was able to find. But you can go in here and search for people's names and see what kind of information they've got. They have photos of Jack Nome after the camps. There is a wonderful transcript of an oral history with the mother of one of our students, and those are all available also on the subject guide. The next site that we looked at is called Sorted by Name, and this is run by one man. He had started it out by going through the National Archives records and finding their lists of information and parsing it out and creating his own website where you can get easy access to information on the internees. More recently, he started adding other information about the citizenship in general in the United States. And it's a wonderful starting point for finding basic information about people. And that site looks like this. It's a very simple site. You can have just the first letter of the last name and you drill down. In this case, we were looking for Jack Nome. So you'd pick an N and just start drilling down until you get to the end results. He usually has just a basic paragraph about the individual. In this case, for Jack Nome, this is the result you get. His name, the year he was born and what state he was born in, where he was living when he was ordered to report to the Portland Assembly System. And he was living in Multnomah County because he was attending what was then called Oregon State College. Now it's Oregon State University. Go Beavers. After he left the Portland Assembly Center, he was interned at the Minnedoka Center with his family. We have the listing of the actual file number. So if you are at the National Archives, you can have them pull up those records. But it also gives us some simple links to go to the National Archives and sort for the information ourselves. And most importantly, he tells us what name the individual is listed under in those records. So then you can go to the National Archives and Records Administration and look at their databases. The link here is in particular for the records about Japanese Americans relocated during World War II. This site allows you to search on any kind of small piece of information you might have. We wanted to search for K-Ike-Ue, so a lot of back and forth. The first data entry form looks like this. Last name, first name, anything that you can think of. I found when using this that using just the last name and then sorting the results was the most easy way to find somebody. So we decided to search for K-Ike-Ue. He happens to be the first entry on this list, and you can sort by any of these fields that have the tiny triangle over them. So if we want to see his results, we click on the tiny icon of a document, and that takes us to this page. So for this one, this is the full record for K, and if you click on any of the underlined items, it will give you an explanation of what some of these are, like what this last permanent address number means, what these father's occupation numbers mean. And in this case, we show that he was sent to the Poston camp from the Colorado River War Relocation Center. We can also see that his father had been a farm operator or manager. It tells us if he ever went to Japan, and he was never sent to Japan. The Issei, the first generation Japanese Americans, the ones that came from Japan and then were naturalized, they usually sent their children to Japan when they were younger to learn Japanese, stay with grandparents, whatever. In this case, he did not. He was single. We see here that he had already completed 1 year of college. He was a Buddhist, and they have the potential occupations that they thought he would be good for. And as we'll see later in the presentation, they were seriously under evaluating him. Draftsman and skilled linesman was not going to be in his future. Another good area to look for information on the students was the Library of Congress, where they have digitized the Japanese American internment camp newspapers. And there are 29 newspapers in total. These are usually in English and Japanese, so that they are available to both the Issei and the Nisei. And those newspapers were basically actually just mimeograph newsletters. Some of them were daily, some were weekly. These newspapers can be keyword searched on the website. They have information such as visiting hours at the camp hospital, the menu today at the cafeteria, if they had one, information for the grade schools and high schools that existed on the campuses, or on the campuses, in the camps. Those schools are usually taught by internees, but they also included information about students who had been accepted at Midwest colleges. And that is where I found a few more students of ours. I searched on the word Rolla, and it pulled up a lot of people that I hadn't seen previously. We can zoom in on this one as well. And you can see here we find Katsumi Don Kozeni, student, departed for Rolla, Missouri. This is a way that we found those 3 additional students. I found James Toru Nishioka this way. So it gives us a lot of information, and you can see the kinds of things that these newsletters covered. Hours at the hospital, they had a tuberculosis ward, general information from the government, classes that are being offered for folks, teaching people how to do shorthand, things like that, and that there was a movie in Block 18 that evening. Another really good newspaper site is at the Hoover Institute, and it is called the Hoji Shinbun Digital Collection. They have the world's largest, as they say, online archive of open access, full image Japanese American and other overseas Japanese newspapers in Asia and South America. This collection can also be keyword searched, but it involves a much larger time period. So through this, I was able to look at the lives of our students before they came here, when they were still in grade school and high school, and in some cases, information after they left the camps. I found engagement notices and things like that. This collection covers so many different states. There are Chicago versions of these newspapers. And again, they're usually in English and Japanese. And I'll show you what that site looks like. They have a wide variety of information, but you can enter a person's name, such as Jack Nome, hit enter, hit enter. And it will pull up all of the different newspapers that have Jack Nome or a version of Jack and or Nome. If we go through, we can find that there are a wide variety of things that we can see on this site. If we put the name in quote marks, it'll be much more specific. The Pacific Citizen magazine is the print magazine for the Japanese American Citizens League that was established in 1929, and they still have a magazine in print. Most of their back issues are digitized and freely available online, and this is another good place to find information before and after the internment. This link at the bottom is for a special issue that they put out in 2010 called the Graduation Issue. This is what their main website looks like, and you can go to the digital archives there. But the special issue was devoted to the ceremonies that were held at the University of California campuses to award honorary diplomas to the students who had been let loose during the internment process. They provide extensive lists for each campus of the names of the students who were honored. And everybody was invited to these ceremonies. Many of these people had passed away, but their families were invited. And we were able to find many of our students in here, such as up here you can see Makoto Joseph Kawaguchi. But if we go to page 11, we find an actual photo of Satoshi Kuwamoto, who is one of our students. Here he is, second from the left. So this is really wonderful. We know that he was still alive in 2010. We know that he received his honorary diploma, and we can use that information to kind of fill out the information we have upon our students. There are a lot of other resources that we can use to research this topic. They're listed here. The links for these sites are available in that subject guide. Some of them are put out by the universities who had the Nisei students, and some are just collections of the records of the National Japanese American Student Relocation Council. So those are also good places to look for information. Now I wanted to talk a little more depth about 2 of the students who came here. Kei Kaneyuki Ikeyue, who we've already talked about a bit, was one of the first ones to come here, possibly the first. He really set the stage for the rest of the students who came here, helping them find what organizations to belong to, making sure that everybody was contributing to the university. They'd already been through a very selective process, and he was one of the people who really excelled at this. He definitely became a big part of campus and Rolla life. As we talked about earlier, he came here from the Poston camp in 1942. He belonged to the Tech Eating Club, then switched to Engineering's Eating Club. If you're not from our school system, the eating clubs were developed as a way to provide food and in some cases room and board for students, because at that point we did not have dormitories. So belonging to one of these clubs ensured that you were going to get fed every day. He was a member of the student council, on the Rolla board, in all these different organizations. And despite the fact that we had, as a nation, decided these people were not to be trusted, in 1945, he was invited to be a member of the Rifle Club, and he did very well. He was on the St. Pat's board, which even now is a very big deal on our campus. He also had a job at the Ritz Movie Theater in downtown Rolla. The newspaper would have social items about different parties in the community, and he would be listed in those. Dr. Claire Mann, who is the patron saint of the archives here, he, in 1946, had hosted a graduation dinner for his son and 4K. So these students did have campus mentors as well. He was very smart. In 1946, he won that prize we talked about earlier, and he did get his bachelor's in metallurgical engineering. He had then gone to the University of Chicago, and after he received his master's there, he worked for the Atomic Energy Division of American Standard and later went to work for IBM. From the magazines that we had showed earlier and the newspapers, specifically from the Hoji Shinbun collection, we found his engagement notice, which is available on that subject guide, showing when he became engaged to Setsuke Shirao, and I think I pronounced that wrong. They got married and in 1957 moved to Sunnyvale when he started working for IBM, and were both very active in the Mountain View Buddhist Temple. The interesting thing is, as we look at the careers of these 14 students, they cross at so many points in their lives. Many of them went to the same colleges on the West Coast. They came here, they went to MSM, and then a surprising number wind up being members of the Mountain View Buddhist Temple. So they run into each other there. Kay continued to attend our alumni meetings. He was a lifelong member. In many cases, he was doing organizing of mini reunions at professional organization conferences. Almost all of the 14 students did join the Alumni Association and maintain a life membership. Jack Ozawa was actually a member of the Century Club. And in the archives, we do have the cards for the deceased alumni, which provide a much more detailed view of the careers of these students. And those are also available to be researched through. The next student we want to talk about is Jack Nome, who is arguably one of the most popular students on our campus. He was born in 1924, passed away in April of 2010, and he had been a freshman at Oregon State, then it was called Oregon State College, before being sent to the Portland Assembly Center, which used to be, as Larry had mentioned, Livestock Exposition Center. In an article for the Oregon State University alumni newsletter, he talked about what that was like, and that the place had a pasture for grazing. So the Nisei that had been sent there created a baseball diamond. We played a lot of ball, Nome said. He was then transferred to the Minnedoka War Relocation Center. And while he was there, he served as a farm laborer for farmers in the area. In 1943, he got his FBI clearance to come to MSM, and we can see that in the June 5th, 1943 issue of the Minnedoka Irrigator, one of the camp newspapers. And that, again, is also on the subject guide. We know from looking at his information in the Hoji Shinbun collection and the Pacific Citizen collection that all through his life he had been a student athlete and a student leader. He was a black belt in judo, a Oregon high school wrestling state champion. He was our quarterback. You can see, I'll zoom in on this one too. Lovely photo of him from the yearbook with the with the football, the classic quarterback pose. This is a photo of him and his wife at a wedding after he graduated. They were attendants at the wedding. This is not their wedding. We have a wonderful portrait of him from his obituary. This is him after he retired from Boeing. And apparently he was quite the fisherman. So we've got him with one of his prize catches. He was also a scholar. In 1945, he was a Lucy Worth James Scholar, and on our campus, that is considered quite an honor. He graduated with his bachelor's in electrical engineering in 1946. We can also see, much like we saw with Kay's student card earlier, we can see the back of his card and see all the different activities that he participated in. Like Kay, he joined the tech club and then transitioned to the engineers club. He was a student assistant in the library. He was a member of AIEE and served as their chairman. He was on the student council and served as president for 2 years or a year and a half, member of the Independents and was their president. He was a business manager for the Rolla board. He earned his letter in football in 1945. Excuse me. Interestingly, he is the only one of the 14 who actually pledged to a social fraternity. Many of the students belong to professional fraternities, but he is the lone one to apply to become a member of Triangle. And if you look through the yearbooks at that time had many candid snapshots from parties, dances, the St. Pat's events, things like that. You will not see the Nisei students in those photos. I can't say for sure what that says about the campus and how welcoming they were in the more social aspects of the university. But the only photos we would see of the Nisei students that were not official portraits would be in groups of people who were in these organizations with them. So take that as you will. He was on the honor list many years. We have his graduation information, his grade point, and that is out of 3.0. There were very few 3.0s at that time. This is kind of interesting. The Rolla Daily Herald at the time would carry social and other kind of information about the university. And in this particular case, they have an article on him becoming the president of the student council. But in the newspaper, it's situated right next to an ad for war bonds that contains the very, very stereotypical caricature of a Japanese soldier. This is definitely jarring to our eyes. I cannot imagine that this made the Nisei students feel very welcome on campus, even though they are American citizens. After graduation, Jack started working back on the West Coast, first in Ontario, Oregon, in their engineering offices, and then with the Bonneville Power Administration, and then finally going to work for Boeing for 35 years. While he was there, he started work on the KC-135s and stayed there through the 757 programs. He was part of the original 747 team and delivered the first of the models to Japan, where he delivered them to another MSM graduate who was from his same class, and Caucasian American student who had moved to Japan. In 1950, he married Tame Fujihara, and they moved to Seattle to raise their family. That's when he was working with Boeing. In June of 2008, Oregon State had program similar to the University of California, and they awarded him with an honorary Bachelor's of Science diploma. There were other students who came to our campus who were also very successful. The Kuamoto brothers actually did not go into engineering, though they both did very well while they were here. They went back to Fresno and worked on their family's hardware store, Aki Hardware, which continued for many, many years to be very important to the Japanese American community in Fresno. Shigeru Fujimoto, I could not find what happened to him or to Donald Yamamoto. James Toru Nishioka, I was able to find his obituary online and then did some research on his children and was able to connect with his son Galen, who provided some more information on his life after he had left here. He is the only student who came here without having been a college student previously. He had graduated from high school while he was in the camp and then got accepted to come here to school and apparently did receive a scholarship to do that. But when he left the camp in 45, or when the family left the camp in early 45, he left school here. He didn't graduate from here, but he went back out west and got a degree in accounting and served as an accountant for 30 some years. The family gave me that kind of information, but we also found out that he had enlisted in the Army for a short period in between. So there are other ways to find information about our students. One of the students, Jack Kunio Ozawa, he actually moved to the East Coast, if you can call Philadelphia the East Coast, I guess you can, where he was very active in the Japanese American Citizens League, both in Philadelphia and in New York City. And he is one of the people who actually became involved in seeking redress from the US government. And that is going to lead into Larry coming back and talking about that process and what all went into that. Take it away, Larry.
Thank you, Deb. On a serious note, and truly serious note, the United States government faced a reckoning with these 120,000 people once the war was over. The Federal Reserve determined that the property losses, the personal property losses of these roughly 120,000 folks was about $400 million. And there's a piece of legislation that President Truman signs in 1948, and you see it there, the Japanese-American Evacuation Claims Act. And these folks who had been moved to the internment camps could make a claim for restitution of the property that they lost, but the total amount that was awarded to them was only $37 million. And it has to do with the difficulty of making a claim that you could confirm. Now, that's it for about 30 years. But in the American Bicentennial, 1976, President Gerald Ford issued a very simple proclamation about what happened to Japanese Americans during World War II. It was not really an apology. It was a statement about a mistake that the United States had made. And I want to read the one sentence that's critical in his proclamation. "We have learned from the tragedy of that long ago experience forever to treasure liberty and justice for each individual American and resolve that this kind of action shall never again be repeated." And again, it's really just a statement about a policy that had gone wrong rather than a direct apology for what had happened. But the value of Ford's proclamation, and you can see that it was actually done on the anniversary date of Franklin Roosevelt's issuing of executive order on February 19th of 1942, his action did lead to some lobbying efforts to provide some compensation for what had been lost, and it leads to the Congress appointing a commission in 1980, and they worked for 2 years with a very large staff, going through a mountain of documents. They had 20 days of hearings, brought in over 750 witnesses who happened to be both those who were in the camps, government officials, and in addition, they brought in several historians to provide testimony. And at the conclusion of their efforts in 1982, they reached a conclusion that everybody on the commission agreed with. And the operative sentence in that conclusion was, the incarceration of Japanese Americans in World War II was a, quote, grave injustice, and it was motivated by racial prejudice, war hysteria, and the failure of political leadership. So what this commission did was to say there were three fundamental reasons for this action. One was the general racial prejudice at the time that whites had toward Japanese Americans. The second reason was all of the hysteria generated by headlines in West Coast newspapers. And they didn't specifically mention President Franklin Roosevelt when they said the failure of political leadership, but that's who that is directed towards. Well, with this conclusion, it adds momentum to what those who were seeking some kind of redress in a tangible way were seeking. And there's one more piece of fuel to this fire, and that has to do with a court case in 1984 involving a man named Fred Korematsu. Fred Korematsu had been arrested in 1942 for violating the order to go to the assembly centers. And when he went to trial, his lawyers argued that because Korematsu was a citizen of the United States, his civil rights had been violated, specifically due process. But the lawyers prosecuting Korematsu argued that fundamentally this was a question of war necessity, and the court agreed. So Korematsu and his lawyers appealed the decision, and it reaches the U.S. Supreme Court in 1944, and the court rules with a 6-3 vote that the original court had been correct, that this was not a statement about Korematsu's citizenship rights, it was a matter of war necessity. Well, Korematsu didn't give up. He and a team of lawyers on his behalf filed a new suit in 1983, and in a federal district court in California, Korematsu versus the United States, this case is 1984 when they rendered a decision, the court ruled that the prosecutors in the original case had misled the court. They had not provided the evidence that I shared with you earlier in this presentation, where those four commissions had concluded that Japanese Americans posed no threat to national security. So the district court in California did not and could not overturn a Supreme Court decision, but it did order that his original conviction be vacated. So in essence, it overturned that original conviction. Well, the buildup of all this leads to a piece of legislation that is passed by both houses of Congress in 1988 and signed by President Ronald Reagan, and it had two critical pieces to it. One was the first formal apology by the federal government to all these people who had suffered during the internment, and then they were given a 10-year window to apply for a redress. And in her report to the Congress, Attorney General Janet Reno in 1999 gave a full report of how much money was given to all the claimants who came forward, and the grand total was 82,219 claimants, all paid $20,000. So the compensation was just over $1.6 billion. So it took over 40 years, but finally the federal government did address a wrong. It did right a wrong. So that's the national context for this. There is one more opportunity for Debbie to share with you again the resources that are available for this. Debbie?
Thank you, Larry. Okay, this is the subject guide. On that site, we have a wide variety of information. This is what it looks like. The Home tab has lists of books and documents. The posters that are part of the Smithsonian exhibit are here in a gallery. Let's see. With the questions about them. Links to material from the State Historical Society. We have the Educator's Guide that goes with the exhibit. We've got the research sites that we talked about during the presentation today. You can click on any of those to go get more information. We have video on the films on demand site on campus, which if you have a campus ID, you can go and look at all of that various material. We also have a second page on there for the students. And on this page, we have individual tabs for each one of the Nisei students where you can go and get more information about them here on campus. We have information on them. We have their student cards. In the case of some of them, we've got more material than others. So you can pick any one of these and go and find more information. There's also a tab for the Rolla and the Rolla Herald that has links to various pages from those magazines and things. In individual sites, there will be things that will have links to different things such as their obituary. In the case of Masashi, we've got a link to his patent site for the government, things like that. For Miles Noboru Suda, we have a link to the oral history that his mother had done on the camps. Can certainly are welcome to come down and look at the materials here with an appointment or use the subject guide online.
Thank you, Debbie. Thank you, Larry. That was wonderful. Check out that subject guide, or you can make an appointment with either Debbie or myself to view any materials that we might have related to the exhibit or this, and come in and view the materials in person yourself. We welcome you to do that. Otherwise, we hope you all have a good day.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.